brass rubbing at Gormley Abbey. I had not intended to visit Gormley Abbey that autumn. Indeed, I confess that until Mr. Whitmore's letter arrived at my Cambridge rooms in late September, I had scarcely heard the name spoken, save perhaps in passing reference to some obscure charter dispute of the 13th century. But Whitmore, who held the living at nearby Ashford St. Mary, possessed that peculiar enthusiasm for local antiquities which marks the true country parson, and his description of a remarkable series of monumental brasses, quite untouched by modern restorers, proved irresistible to one whose summers are habitually devoted to such pursuits. The journey from Cambridge proved agreeable enough. The branch line that serves that corner of Suffolk winds through countryside unmarked by industry's harsher impositions, where hedgerows still follow boundaries established in Domesday, and church towers rise from villages that have known neither growth nor decline for centuries past. It was the sort of landscape that invites contemplation of England's layered history, each field and copse a palimpsest of human endeavour stretching back beyond written record. Ashford St. Mary itself proved a typical Suffolk village, a handful of timber-framed cottages arranged about a triangular green, a small Norman church with later additions, and the inevitable Red Lion Inn, where I had arranged to lodge during my stay. Whitmore met me at the modest station platform, a cheerful, ruddy-faced man in his 50s, with the slight stoop that marks the habitual student of manuscripts and memorial inscriptions. "Professor Ashton," he called, advancing with hand extended, "what a pleasure to meet you at last. I do hope the journey wasn't too tiresome. These rural lines can be rather trying, I'm afraid." I assured him that the journey had been perfectly acceptable, and we were soon settled in his dog cart for the short drive to the village. As we jogged along the narrow lane, Whitmore proved an informative companion, pointing out features of local interest, the earthworks of a vanished manor house, a stretch of Roman road still traceable in the field boundaries, and finally, rising above a screen of ancient yews, the broken tower of Gormley Abbey itself. "There she is," said Whitmore with evident pride, "or what remains of her, founded in 1147 by Roger de Gormley, a rather grasping fellow by all accounts, but he built well. The dissolution was thorough here, I'm afraid. The locals made free with the stone for their own building projects, but enough remains to give one a sense of what it must have been." I studied the ruins as we approached. The abbey church was reduced to foundations and the lower courses of walls, but the tower stood nearly complete, its Norman arches still framing empty sky. More substantially preserved was what had clearly been the chapter house, a fine example of early English work, with lancet windows still retaining traces of their original glazing. It was here, Whitmore explained, that the brasses were to be found. "The floor was never lifted," he continued as we drew up before the ruins. "Remarkable, really, when one considers how thoroughly the rest was pillaged. Perhaps the locals had some superstitious reluctance to disturb the dead. At any rate, we have there a complete collection of memorial brasses spanning some 3 centuries, abbots, benefactors, a few knights who chose burial within the precinct. Most are in excellent condition, though sadly the matrices of several have been plundered for their metal." We dismounted and made our way through the ruined nave toward the chapter house. The October afternoon was drawing in, and long shadows stretched across the broken pavements where once the brothers had walked in contemplation. There was about the place that particular melancholy which clings to all ruins, but something more besides, a sense of watchfulness, as if the stones themselves retained memory of their former purpose. The chapter house retained its roof, though much patched with later tiles, and the interior, while open to the elements through broken windows, preserved an atmosphere of ecclesiastical dignity. But it was the floor that immediately commanded attention. Even in the failing light, I could make out the dark outlines of memorial slabs set into the medieval pavement, and the distinctive yellow gleam of brass inlay catching what illumination remained. "Magnificent," I murmured, kneeling beside the nearest monument, a fine effigy of an abbot in pontificals, his crozier and mitre rendered with admirable skill. "And you say these have never been properly recorded?" "Never systematically," Whitmore replied. "The County Archaeological Society made a brief survey in the 1880s, but their notes are sadly inadequate. I had hoped that someone of your expertise might be willing to undertake a proper study." I needed little persuasion. Here was precisely the sort of project that had occupied my happiest hours for the past 20 years, the patient recording and interpretation of our medieval heritage. We arranged that I should return the following morning with my rubbing materials, and that Whitmore would provide such assistance as his parish duties allowed. As we prepared to depart, I paused for a final look about the chapter house. The light was now nearly gone, and in the gathering dusk, the memorial brasses seemed to glow with their own faint luminescence. It was then that I noticed, in the far corner beneath the easternmost window, a slab that appeared different from the others, darker somehow, and partially obscured by what looked like centuries of accumulated debris. "That one there," I said, pointing, "in the corner. What can you tell me of it?" Whitmore peered through the gloom. "Ah yes, I'm not certain, to be honest. It's rather difficult to make out, isn't it? The local children used to tell stories about that corner, claimed it was always cold, even in summer. Nonsense, of course, but you know how these tales persist." As we walked back toward the cart, I found myself glancing over my shoulder at the chapter house. The broken windows stared back like empty eye sockets, and I had the oddest sensation that something within was observing our departure. But the feeling passed, and I attributed it to nothing more than the natural melancholy of such places at twilight. At the Red Lion, Mrs. Bramley provided an excellent dinner of roast mutton and apple tart, while her husband regaled me with such local history as he possessed. Much of it, I suspected, embellished in the telling, but when the conversation turned to the Abbey, I noticed a certain reserve descend upon the company. "Queer place, that," old Bramley admitted at length. "Always has been. My grandfather, he helped cart away stone from the ruins back in the 1840s, that would be, and he used to say, you could never work there comfortable like, always the feeling someone was watching, if you take my meaning." His wife nodded vigorously. "And the sounds," she added, "especially of a winter's evening, like singing. Some say, though, there's been no choir there these 400 years. I smiled politely at these tales, as becomes a man of education confronted with rustic superstition. Yet I confess that as I retired to my chamber that night, the memory of that darkened corner in the chapter house lingered strangely in my thoughts. It was some time before sleep came, and when it did, my dreams were filled with the sound of plain chant echoing through empty cloisters, and the gleam of brass catching candlelight in a vast, shadowy church. I rose early the next morning, eager to begin my work. The October day dawned clear and crisp, with that peculiar quality of light that autumn brings to the English countryside, sharp-edged and golden, lending even the most ordinary landscape an air of significance. After a substantial breakfast, I loaded my materials into Whitmore's cart: rolls of rubbing paper, blocks of heel-ball brushes for cleaning the brasses, and my leather satchel containing notebooks, measuring tools, and the various implements of the antiquarian's trade. Whitmore had been called away on parish business, a sick parishioner in one of the outlying farms, but promised to join me later in the day. I confess I was not entirely sorry to have the Abbey to myself for the morning. There is something to be said for solitary communion with the monuments of the past, free from well-meaning interruption, and the need for constant explanation of one's methods. The chapter house seemed somehow different in the morning light, less mysterious, more simply what it was, the remnant of a great religious foundation, its stones warmed by centuries of sunlight and prayer. The memorial brasses, too, revealed themselves more clearly, and I could see at once that Whitmore had not exaggerated their quality. Here was work to occupy me for several days at least. I began with the abbot's effigy that had first caught my attention, a superb example of 14th century craftsmanship. The inscription, in elegant Lombardic capitals, identified the figure as Dominus Robertus des Ashby, Abbas Hugus Loti, who had died in the year of grace, 1347. The execution was remarkably fine. Every fold of the vestments, every detail of the pastoral staff, rendered with loving precision. As I worked, carefully cleaning the surface and preparing my paper, I found myself wondering about this long-dead prelate. What manner of man had he been? Had he been a scholar, a builder, a mystic? The brass gave no clue beyond the conventional symbols of his office. The rubbing proceeded smoothly. The brass was in excellent condition, with only minor losses at the edges, and the impression came through clearly on my paper. By midday, I had completed not only the abbot's effigy, but also those of two 14th-century knights, Sir Geoffrey de Gormley, presumably a descendant of the founder, and Sir William Maunsell, whose arms I could not immediately identify, but whose inscription dated his death to 1389. It was as I was gathering my materials for a brief lunch that I decided to investigate the curious slab I had noticed the previous evening. In full daylight, it appeared even more anomalous. Where the other monuments were of the usual grey Purbeck marble with brass inlays, this was of some darker stone, perhaps a local limestone, and heavily stained with what looked like centuries of damp. More puzzling still, it seemed to have been deliberately obscured. A heap of rubble, clearly not fallen by chance, had been arranged to partially conceal the slab, and when I began to clear this away, I found beneath it a layer of what appeared to be medieval mortar, as if someone had attempted to seal the monument from view. The work of clearing proved more laborious than I had anticipated. The mortar had set with the hardness of stone, and it was only by patient work with hammer and chisel that I was able to remove it. But as the surface gradually emerged, I began to see that my efforts were being rewarded. This was no ordinary memorial, where the other brasses showed the conventional effigies of their subjects, hands clasped in prayer, feet resting on symbolic animals, faces bearing the serene expression of Christian death. This displayed something altogether more unusual. The figure, when at last I had exposed it fully, was that of a monk in the habit of the Benedictine order, but there was something wrong with the representation, something that made me pause and examine it more closely. The hands, instead of being folded in prayer, were raised as if in supplication, or perhaps warding off some unseen threat. The face, too, was strange. The features seemed to writhe and shift as I looked at them, an effect I attributed at first to some trick of the light, or perhaps to deliberate ambiguity on the part of the medieval craftsman. But it was the inscription that truly gave me pause. Unlike the clear Latin of the other monuments, this text was partially in some vernacular tongue, Middle English, perhaps, though in a dialect I could not immediately identify. What I could make out seemed to tell a disturbing tale. Hic asset Frater Aelredis, Monicus Melus, qui peccavit contra, sepultus, sine benediction. Here lies brother Aelred, evil monk, who sinned against, buried without blessing. The fragments were tantalizing, but their import was clear enough. This was no conventional memorial, but rather a record of disgrace, perhaps even damnation. As I worked to clean the brass more thoroughly, other details emerged. Around the border of the slab, in place of the usual prayers for the soul's repose, was inscribed what appeared to be a series of binding formulas, Latin words of warding and constraint, that seemed more appropriate to an exorcism than a funeral monument, and in the corners, instead of the conventional symbols of the evangelists, were carved what I could only describe as warning signs, crude but unmistakable representations of chains and locks. The more I studied this singular monument, the more convinced I became that I had stumbled upon something of considerable historical significance. Here, apparently, was evidence of some scandal within the abbey, a monk so disgraced that even in death he could not be granted the usual rites of Christian burial. The implications for our understanding of medieval monastic discipline were considerable. I set about making a rubbing with particular care, aware that I might be the first scholar to examine this monument properly since its creation. The brass, while corroded in places, yielded a reasonably clear impression, though I noticed that certain portions seemed to resist my efforts. The paper would not lie flat, as if the metal itself were somehow uneven or distorted. It was while I was engaged in this delicate work that I first became aware of the cold. The morning had been pleasantly mild, but as the day wore on, the temperature in the chapter house seemed to drop markedly. At first I attributed this to the natural chill of stone buildings, but gradually I realized that the cold was not evenly distributed. The area around Brother Aelred's monument was noticeably colder than the rest of the chamber, so much so that my breath began to mist as I worked. More disturbing still were the sounds. As I knelt beside the brass, concentrating on my rubbing, I became gradually aware of what seemed to be whispers, not words that I could distinguish, but a susurrus of sibilant sounds that appeared to emanate from the stones themselves. When I paused in my work to listen more carefully, the sounds ceased, but they resumed as soon as I returned to my task. It was perhaps 3 o'clock when Whitmore arrived, his cheerful voice echoing through the ruins as he called my name. I was surprised to realize how relieved I was to hear another human voice, and as I rose from my work, my knees stiff from kneeling on the cold stone, I found that my hands were trembling slightly. "Good heavens, Ashton," Whitmore exclaimed as he entered the chapter house. "You look positively blue with cold. How long have you been working?" "Since this morning," I replied, grateful for his companionship. I fear I became rather absorbed in my work. Whitmore approached the monument I had been studying, and I saw his expression change as he took in the scene, the cleared rubble, the exposed brass, my rubbing materials scattered about the slab. "I say," he said quietly, "you've been working on that one, have you? The one in the corner?" "Indeed, a most remarkable find, I believe. Some sort of penitential monument, quite possibly unique in England." But Whitmore did not seem to share my enthusiasm. His face had grown grave, and he was studying the brass with what appeared to be unease rather than scholarly interest. "You know," he said at length, "there are stories about that particular spot. The local people have always avoided it, said to be cursed, though I never put much stock in such tales." "Cursed?" I could not keep a note of amusement from my voice. "My dear Whitmore, surely a man of the cloth cannot give credence to such superstitions." No, of course not," he replied hastily. "It's just that, well, there have been incidents over the years, nothing that couldn't be explained rationally, you understand. But," he paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, then continued, "in 1923, a party of archaeologists from the county society attempted to excavate around that corner. They gave up after 2 days, claimed the ground was too hard, but I heard later that they'd experienced some rather unpleasant disturbances." "What sort of disturbances?" "Oh, the usual nonsense. Strange sounds, unexplained drops in temperature, that sort of thing. One of them claimed to have seen a figure in monastic habit, but I'm sure it was nothing more than suggestion and shadow." As Whitmore spoke, I felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the stones, for I had not mentioned to him the whispers I had heard, nor the curious way the cold seemed to center on the monument, yet here he was, describing precisely the phenomena I had experienced. "Perhaps," I said, attempting to maintain a tone of scholarly detachment, "you could tell me what you know of this Brother Aelred. The inscription suggests some sort of scandal." Whitmore glanced around the chapter house, as if to ensure we were alone, then lowered his voice. "There are references in the Abbey chronicles, fragmentary, you understand, and couched in the usual euphemisms. Apparently there was some sort of crisis in the late 14th century. A monk was accused of, well, the exact nature of his crimes is never specified, but the language suggests something rather serious. Heresy perhaps, or worse. And he was buried here? According to the records, he died in the Abbey prison. They had their own jowl, you know, for dealing with wayward brothers. The usual practice would have been burial in unconsecrated ground, but for some reason, he was interred here in the chapter house. The chronicle mentions special precautions being taken, but gives no details." As we stood there in the gathering dusk, for the afternoon was well advanced, I became aware once again of that sense of watchfulness I had felt the previous evening. The empty windows seemed to regard us with particular attention, and I found myself glancing frequently at the darkening corners of the chamber. "I think," said Whitmore at length, "that perhaps we should continue this discussion tomorrow. The light is failing, and these old ruins can be rather treacherous after dark." I could find no fault with his suggestion, though I confess I was reluctant to leave the monument unfinished. As I gathered my materials, I noticed that the rubbing I had been making seemed somehow different, the lines less clear, the details obscured as if by shadow. When I held it up to the failing light, I could have sworn that the figure's hands had shifted position, the raised arms now seeming to reach toward the viewer in desperate supplication. But such fancies are common enough in the twilight hours, and I dismissed the notion as a trick of tired eyes and shifting illumination. As we walked back toward the village, Whitmore maintained an unusually subdued silence, and I found myself frequently looking back toward the Abbey ruins, though I could not have said what I expected to see. That night at the Red Lion, over dinner, and a glass of the landlord's excellent port, Whitmore regaled me with more conventional local history, but I noticed that he carefully avoided any further mention of Brother Aelred, or the monument in the corner of the chapter house. For my part, I found my thoughts continually returning to that singular brass and its cryptic inscription. What crime could have been so heinous as to warrant such treatment, and why had later generations felt it necessary to conceal the monument so thoroughly? It was well past midnight before I finally sought my bed, and even then, sleep was long in coming. The wind had risen, and it moaned through the eaves of the old inn, with a sound not unlike the whispers I had heard in the chapter house. More than once I found myself starting awake, convinced that I had heard footsteps in the corridor outside my room, but each time I investigated, I found nothing but empty shadows and the settling sounds of an old building. When at last I did sleep, my dreams were filled with visions of a dark figure in monastic robes, its face hidden in shadow, walking endlessly through the ruined cloisters of Gormley Abbey, and always, in these dreams, I had the sense that the figure was searching for something, or someone. I woke the next morning with a peculiar sense of unease, as if some half-remembered dream continued to cast its shadow over the daylight hours. The sensation was not improved by the discovery that my rubbing of Brother Aelred's monument, which I had carefully rolled and placed in my satchel the previous evening, was now somehow damaged. Several sections appeared to have been abraded or torn, and the overall impression was far less clear than I remembered. Most puzzling of all, the paper seemed to have taken on a yellowish tinge, as if aged by decades rather than hours. At breakfast, Mrs. Bramley remarked upon my pale appearance, with the solicitude of a natural hostess, pressing upon me an extra helping of eggs and bacon. Her husband too seemed to regard me with unusual attention. "Didn't sleep well, Professor?" he inquired. "These old buildings can be uncommon noisy of a night. Timbers settling, mice in the walls, that sort of thing." I assured him that I had slept adequately, though I did not mention the curious dreams that had troubled my rest. As I prepared to return to the abbey, I found myself oddly reluctant to face another day alone among the ruins. Perhaps it was merely the natural result of spending too many hours in solitary contemplation of medieval mortality, but I could not shake the feeling that something in that chapter house was actively hostile to my presence. Whitmore had promised to join me early, but a message arrived with my breakfast tray, informing me that he had been called away to conduct a funeral in a neighboring parish, and would not return until late afternoon. The prospect of spending the entire day alone at the abbey filled me with an unaccountable dread, but scholarly duty prevailed over superstitious fancy, and I set out with my materials as planned. The morning was overcast, with a lowering sky that promised rain before evening. The abbey ruins seemed somehow more oppressive, under the grey canopy of clouds, their broken stones dark with moisture from the night's heavy dew. As I approached the chapter house, I was struck once again by the particular quality of silence that hung over the place, not the peaceful quiet of abandonment, but something more active, as if the very air were listening. I had intended to continue my work on Brother Aelred's monument, but as I entered the chapter house, I was disturbed to find that someone or something had been there before me. The rubble I had so carefully cleared away the previous day had been replaced, not haphazardly, but with what seemed like deliberate intent. Moreover, the stones were arranged in a pattern I had not noticed before, a rough circle surrounding the monument, with gaps that might have been intended as entrances or exits. My first thought was that some local person, perhaps motivated by the superstitious reverence Whitmore had mentioned, had attempted to reseal the monument, but as I examined the arrangement more closely, I began to doubt this explanation. The work had clearly been done during the night, yet the stones showed no signs of having been recently moved. No scrape marks, no disturbed earth, no trace of the considerable effort such a task would have required. More unsettling still was the discovery that my rubbing materials, which I was certain I had gathered up the previous evening, were scattered about the chapter house in apparent disorder. My measuring rod had been bent into an impossible curve, as if subjected to tremendous pressure, and several sheets of my best rubbing paper bore what looked like scorch marks, though there was no conceivable source of heat in the ruins. As I stood there attempting to make sense of these phenomena, I became aware of a sound that made my blood run cold. From somewhere within the ruins, not the chapter house itself, but from the direction of the vanished nave, came the unmistakable sound of chanting, not the crude approximation that untrained voices might produce, but the polished plain song of trained religious, rising and falling in the ancient melodies of the divine office. I stood transfixed, listening to that impossible music. The voices were distant but clear, singing what I recognized as the office of the dead, that solemn liturgy reserved for the burial of the faithful. But there was something wrong with the chanting, some quality that made it deeply disturbing, rather than consoling. The rhythm was slightly off, the harmonies subtly discordant, as if the singers were deliberately corrupting the sacred music for some blasphemous purpose. The chanting continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then gradually faded away, leaving behind a silence that seemed even more oppressive than before. I stood there for some time longer, straining my ears for any repetition of the phenomenon, but heard nothing save the whisper of wind through broken stone. Gathering my courage, I decided to investigate the source of the sounds. The ruins of the nave were extensive, with enough standing walls and collapsed masonry to provide concealment for any number of trespassers. Perhaps some group of local enthusiasts had decided to stage a historical reenactment, though the idea seemed far-fetched given the remoteness of the site and the early hour. But my search revealed nothing. The nave was as empty and desolate as it had been the previous day, with no sign of recent human presence. The grass growing between the broken pavements was undisturbed, and spiderwebs stretched unbroken across many of the archways. If anyone had been there recently, they had left no trace of their passage. Returning to the chapter house, I resolved to continue my work, despite these distractions. Scholarly investigation, I told myself, must not be deterred by unexplained phenomena, however disturbing. I began the laborious process of again clearing the rubble from Brother Aelred's monument, noting as I did so that the stones seemed reluctant to be moved, not through any physical resistance, but in some subtler way, as if they possessed a will of their own, and preferred to remain where they were. As I worked, I found myself listening constantly for any repetition of the chanting, but the abbey remained silent, save for the occasional cry of a crow, or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Yet I could not shake the feeling that I was being observed. More than once I looked up from my work, convinced that I had glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision, but each time I found nothing but empty doorways and broken walls. By midday, I had again exposed the curious monument, and I resumed my rubbing with renewed determination, but the work proceeded with unusual difficulty. The paper seemed reluctant to lie flat against the brass, and when I attempted to take an impression, the results were consistently unsatisfactory. Lines that had been clear the previous day now appeared blurred or distorted, and entire sections of the inscription seemed to fade even as I worked on them. It was during one of these frustrating attempts that I first noticed the change in the brass itself. Where previously the metal had been dulled by centuries of corrosion, it now seemed to gleam with an inner light, not the healthy glow of polished copper, but something colder and more unsettling. And as I watched, transfixed, I could have sworn that the figure's features began to shift and change. The face, which I had initially taken for that of a penitent monk, now seemed to bear an expression of malevolent intelligence. The eyes, mere suggestions in the corroded metal, appeared to focus upon me with unmistakable awareness, and the hands, raised in what I had interpreted as supplication, now seemed to be reaching toward me with predatory intent. I jerked backward, my heart racing, and in that moment, the illusion, if illusion it was, vanished. The brass resumed its normal appearance, though I noticed that my hands were trembling as I gathered up my materials. Clearly, I told myself, I was suffering from the effects of too much solitary work in this oppressive place. What I needed was human companionship and rational conversation. But even as I prepared to leave the chapter house, I found myself drawn back to the monument one final time, and there, inscribed in the stone around the brass, I saw something that made my blood run cold. New words had appeared, not carved into the ancient stone, but somehow written there in what looked like fresh scratches. He who disturbs the dead shall join them. The letters were crude, but unmistakable, and they had certainly not been there the previous day. As I stared at this impossible inscription, I heard once again the sound of whispers, but now they seemed to be coming from the monument itself, sibilant voices speaking in languages I could not identify, but whose malevolent intent was unmistakable. I fled then, abandoning my materials, in my haste to escape that accursed place. As I ran through the ruins toward the road, I could hear behind me what sounded like laughter, not human mirth. but something far more sinister, echoing from the broken stones of the abbey, like the voice of damnation itself. I did not stop running until I reached the village, and it was only the familiar sight of the Red Lion's welcoming sign that finally calmed my racing heart. Mrs. Bramley took one look at my disheveled appearance, and immediately pressed a large brandy upon me, asking no questions, but watching me with evident concern. It was there, sitting in the inn's comfortable parlor, with that restorative spirit warming my shaken nerves, that I attempted to make sense of what I had experienced. Clearly there was some explanation for these phenomena, mass hallucination brought on by suggestion and isolation, perhaps, or some natural cause that mimicked supernatural activity. The human mind, I reminded myself, is remarkably susceptible to illusion when placed under sufficient stress. Yet even as I marshaled these rational arguments, I found myself reluctant to return to the abbey. The very thought of that darkened chapter house and its sinister monument filled me with a dread that no amount of scholarly duty could overcome. For the first time in my career as an antiquarian, I was forced to confront the possibility that some secrets of the past were better left undisturbed. When Whitmore finally returned that evening, he found me still in the inn's parlor, staring into the fire with my untouched dinner growing cold beside me. One look at my face was enough to tell him that something had gone seriously amiss. "Good God, Ashton," he exclaimed, "what on earth has happened? You look as if you've seen a ghost." And perhaps, I reflected grimly, that was exactly what I had seen. Whitmore insisted on hearing my account in full, though I could see from his expression that he found my story deeply troubling. When I had finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, staring into his brandy with a frown of concentration. "I think," he said at length, "that it's time I shared with you what I know of the Abbey's history. I had hoped to spare you the more unsettling aspects of the tale, but clearly circumstances have moved beyond such considerations." He rose and went to his study, returning with a small leather-bound volume, which he placed upon the table between us. "This is a copy of the Abbey Chronicle," he explained, "transcribed in the 18th century from the original manuscript, which was unfortunately lost in a fire at the county record office. The account of Brother Aelred's case is fragmentary, but what remains is disturbing." He opened the book and began to read in a low voice. "Anno Domini 1389, in the Feast of All Saints, there came to light certain abominable practices of Brother Aelred, he that was called the Learned, being skilled in the forbidden arts, and given to trafficking with unclean spirits, the which crimes being proved against him by diverse witnesses, he was condemned by the abbot and chapter to perpetual imprisonment, there to remain until God should call him to account for his sins. But the said Aelred, being possessed of devils, did work such marvels in his prison, that none durst approach him, and the very stones of his cell were seen to weep tears of blood, and on the vigil of St. Bartholomew, he was found dead in his chamber, though the door remained locked and barred, and his body bore no mark of violence. Great was the debate among the brothers concerning his burial, for some held that he should be cast into unconsecrated ground, as befitted one who had died unrepentant of heresy, but others feared lest his unquiet spirit work further mischief, and at length it was determined that he should be laid beneath the chapter house floor, there to remain bound by the prayers of the faithful until the day of judgment. Yet even in death, the evil one was not quiet, for strange sounds were heard by night in the chapter house, and lights were seen where no lights should be, and Brother Thomas the sacristan, venturing to investigate these disturbances, was found the next morning stark mad, crying out that the dead monk had spoken to him of things that may not be repeated by Christian men. Therefore did Abbot Walter ordain that the tomb should be sealed with lead and blessed with holy water, and certain binding words were inscribed upon the stone that the evil might be constrained until the end of time, and he commanded moreover that none should speak the name of the accursed one, lest by speaking it they give him power to return. Whitmore closed the book and looked at me gravely. "There is more," he said, "but it becomes increasingly incoherent. References to disappearances among the brothers, to livestock found dead with no apparent cause, to crops failing in the abbey fields. The implication is clear enough, that Brother Aelred's influence continued even after his death." "And the dissolution?" I asked. "What happened then?" "According to local tradition, the commissioners who came to suppress the abbey encountered difficulties. The official records speak only of impediments to the orderly transfer of properties, but there are hints of something more serious. One of the royal agents was found dead in the chapter house under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. Yet the abbey was eventually dissolved. Oh yes, but not in the usual manner. Instead of selling the buildings for conversion to secular use, the crown ordered their destruction. Moreover, the chapter house was specifically designated to remain intact and sealed, a most unusual provision. I pondered this information in silence, trying to reconcile it with my own experiences. That there had been some sort of scandal at the abbey in the 14th century seemed clear enough, but the supernatural elements of the chronicle were surely later embellishments. Yet how to explain what I had witnessed? The chanting, the moving stones, the changing inscription. There is one more thing, Whitmore continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, something I discovered only recently in my predecessor's papers. Apparently, there have been other attempts to study the abbey over the years, always ending in failure, or worse. He produced another document, this one in a more modern hand. This is from the diary of my predecessor, the Reverend Dr. Fitzgerald, dated 1895. He attempted his own investigation of the ruins, with particular attention to the chapter house. Listen to this. The work proceeds slowly, hampered by the most extraordinary difficulties. Workmen refuse to remain on the site, claiming they have heard voices calling to them from beneath the stones. 2 have already given notice, and the remainder work only under protest, and at increased wages. I confess that I myself have experienced certain disturbances that I find difficult to explain in rational terms. Whitmore looked up from the diary. The entry ends there. The next is dated 3 weeks later, and speaks only of abandoning the project for reasons of health. Dr. Fitzgerald died 6 months later. A stroke, the doctors said, though he was barely 50 and had previously enjoyed robust health. And since then, a few amateur antiquarians have made attempts, but none have persisted for more than a day or two. You, Professor Ashton, have spent longer studying that monument than anyone since its original concealment. The implications of this statement were not lost on me. If the pattern held, I could expect my own investigation to end badly, possibly very badly indeed. Yet the scholar in me rebelled against such defeatist thinking. Surely there must be some rational explanation for these phenomena, some natural cause that could account for the strange experiences. These manifestations, I said, assuming for the moment that they are real rather than imaginary, do they follow any particular pattern? Are they seasonal, or tied to specific dates? Whitmore consulted the various documents spread before him. Curious that you should ask, he said. Most of the recorded incidents seem to cluster around 2 periods of the year: All Saints' Eve, when Brother Aelred's crimes were supposedly discovered, and the Feast of St. Bartholomew, when he died. And what is the date today? Whitmore glanced at the calendar on his desk, and I saw his face pale. October the 30th, he said quietly. All Saints' Eve is tomorrow. We sat in silence, contemplating this ominous coincidence. Outside, the wind had risen, and rain began to patter against the windows of the inn. The sound was oddly reminiscent of the whispers I had heard in the chapter house, and I found myself listening for voices in the storm. Perhaps, I said at length, it would be wise to postpone any further investigation until later. Whitmore nodded eagerly. A sensible precaution. There are plenty of other monuments to study. The knight effigies, for instance, or the civilian brasses. Brother Aelred can wait. But even as I agreed to this course of action, I felt a curious reluctance to abandon the project entirely. There was something about that singular monument that continued to fascinate me, despite, or perhaps because of the dangers it might represent. The scholar's curse, I reflected, the inability to leave a mystery unsolved, regardless of the personal cost. That night I retired early, pleading exhaustion, but sleep was again elusive. The wind continued to howl around the eaves of the inn, and more than once I thought I heard other sounds mingled with its voice, chanting perhaps, or the tolling of a bell that no longer existed. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with visions of the abbey in its medieval glory, with cowled figures moving through torch-lit corridors and the sound of plain song echoing from the vaulted nave. But these were not peaceful dreams of monastic devotion. There was something wrong with the scene, some taint of corruption that pervaded everything. The chanting was subtly discordant, The shadows moved independently of their supposed sources, and everywhere there was the sense of watching eyes and hidden malevolence. At the center of it all was a single figure, a monk whose face remained hidden in the depths of his hood, but whose presence radiated an aura of absolute evil. As I watched in horrified fascination, this figure raised one pale hand and pointed directly at me. His lips moved as if speaking, but the words that came were not sounds, but rather a pressure inside my skull, a voice that bypassed the ears entirely. "You have disturbed my rest, scholar, now you shall share my vigil." I woke with a cry, my heart pounding, and my body bathed in cold sweat. The room was pitch dark, but I had the unmistakable sensation that I was not alone. Something was standing at the foot of my bed, not visible in the darkness, but undeniably present. I fumbled for the bedside lamp, and in its sudden glare, the feeling of presence vanished, leaving me alone with my racing pulse and the memory of that terrible dream. But as I reached for my watch to check the time, my blood froze. There, on the bedside table, where no book had been before, lay a small leather-bound volume. With trembling hands, I opened it, and by the lamplight, read the title page. The true and particular account of Brother Aelred the Learned, and of his abominable practices. The book appeared to be very old, its pages yellowed with age, and its binding worn smooth by countless hands. As I turned the pages, I found myself reading an account that was far more detailed and far more disturbing than anything Whitmore had shown me. Here were specifics of Brother Aelred's crimes, described in language that made my flesh crawl: necromancy, devil worship, unspeakable rituals performed in the dead of night, all set down with the careful precision of a legal document. But it was the final entry that chilled me most. "And know ye well that though the body of this accursed monk lies bound beneath the stones, his spirit is not so easily constrained, for he made certain pacts with the powers of darkness that death itself cannot break, and he waits still for one who will complete the work he began. Woe to him who disturbs the sealed tomb, for he shall become the instrument of that which should never again see light." As I read these words, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. My breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost appeared on the window glass, despite the mild October weather outside. The book itself grew cold in my hands, so cold that it burned like ice, but I found I could not put it down. And then, as I stared at the final page, new words began to appear, not printed, but written in what looked like fresh blood. "Tomorrow, scholar, when the veil is thinnest, come to me then, and we shall finish what you have begun." The book burst into flames in my hands, burning with a cold fire that gave no heat. I dropped it to the floor, where it continued to burn without consuming, the flames dancing in patterns that seemed almost like writing. And through it all, I could hear laughter, the same inhuman mirth I had heard in the abbey ruins, echoing now within the very walls of the inn. When morning came, I found no trace of the book, but carved deep into the wooden surface of the bedside table were the words I had seen written in blood: "Tomorrow." I spent the morning of All Saints' Eve in a state of considerable agitation, torn between the rational desire to flee and the scholar's compulsion to see the matter through to its conclusion. Whitmore, observing my condition at breakfast, renewed his suggestions that we postpone any further investigation, but I found myself unable to agree. Something, call it curiosity, or scholarly duty, or perhaps a darker compulsion, drew me inexorably back toward Gormley Abbey and its terrible secret. "You must understand," I told him as we sat in his study that morning, surrounded by his collection of local histories and antiquarian volumes, that to abandon the investigation now would be to betray everything I stand for as a scholar. Whatever the dangers, I cannot simply walk away from what may be the most significant archaeological discovery of my career. Whitmore regarded me with evident concern. "But surely, my dear fellow, no discovery is worth risking one's life or one's sanity. The patterns are clear enough from the historical record. Those who meddle with Brother Aelred's tomb come to grief without exception." "Patterns, yes," I replied, "but coincidences nonetheless. I refuse to believe that a man of the 14th century, however depraved, can reach across 6 centuries to work harm upon the living. There must be some rational explanation for these phenomena, gas escaping from underground sources, perhaps, or some form of mass suggestion brought on by the power of local legends." Even as I spoke these words, I was aware of their inadequacy. How could natural gas explain the book that had appeared and disappeared in my room? How could suggestion account for the physical changes I had witnessed in the brass monument? Yet the alternative, that the dead could indeed return to trouble the living, was too terrible to contemplate. Whitmore shook his head sadly. I fear you are determined upon this course. Whatever I might say, very well. If you must return to the Abbey tonight, at least allow me to accompany you. Whatever manifestations you may encounter, you should not face them alone. I was touched by his offer, though I suspected that his presence would provide little protection against supernatural forces, should such indeed exist. Nevertheless, there was comfort in the thought of companionship during what promised to be a difficult ordeal. We spent the remainder of the day in preparation, gathering such materials as we thought might prove useful: electric torches, camera equipment, and various recording devices that might capture evidence of any unusual phenomena. Whitmore also insisted on bringing his Book of Common Prayer and a small vial of holy water, explaining somewhat sheepishly that while he doubted their efficacy, they could do no harm. As evening approached, we made our way once more to the Abbey ruins. The October night was crisp and clear, with a full moon rising through the bare branches of the surrounding trees. Under its pale light, the broken stones of the Abbey took on an ethereal quality, as if they were but shadows of their former substance. The chapter house, when we reached it, seemed unchanged from my previous visit. The monument in the corner remained partially exposed, the brass gleaming dully in the moonlight that filtered through the broken roof. Yet there was something different about the atmosphere, a sense of expectancy, as if the very stones were waiting for something to occur. We set up our equipment as quietly as possible, though every sound seemed amplified in the sepulchral silence of the ruins. Our torches cast dancing shadows on the ancient walls, creating an ever-shifting pattern of light and darkness that was deeply unsettling to contemplate. "Now what?" whispered Whitmore, glancing nervously about the chapter house. "Now we wait," I replied, settling myself beside Brother Aelred's monument with my notebook and measuring instruments. If the historical accounts are accurate, any manifestations should occur around midnight, the traditional witching hour. The next 2 hours passed with agonizing slowness. We maintained our vigil in near silence, speaking only in whispers, and then only when necessary. I occupied myself with a more detailed examination of the brass, making careful notes of its iconography and attempting to decipher the more obscure portions of its inscription. But as the night wore on, I found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on scholarly matters. The atmosphere in the chapter house was becoming oppressive in the extreme. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and our breath now misted visibly in the frigid air. More disturbing was the growing sense that we were being observed. Though I saw nothing when I looked around the chamber, I could not shake the feeling that eyes were watching us from every shadow, every broken doorway. It was shortly before 11 o'clock that the first unmistakable manifestation occurred. We were sitting in silence, when suddenly the air was filled with the sound of chanting, not the distant echo I had heard previously, but voices that seemed to surround us, coming from every direction at once. The plain song was that same office of the dead I had heard before, but now it was close enough that I could make out individual voices, each singing with the trained precision of a medieval choir. Whitmore gripped my arm, his face pale with terror in the torchlight. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. I nodded, too overcome with awe and fear to speak, for this was no hallucination or trick of the wind. The voices were unmistakably real, filling the chapter house with their solemn harmonies. Yet when I directed my torch beam toward the source of the sound, I saw nothing but empty air. The chanting continued for several minutes, then gradually faded away, leaving behind a silence that seemed even more oppressive than before. We sat frozen, waiting for the next manifestation, and we did not have long to wait. At the stroke of 11:30, I know the precise time, because Whitmore was obsessively checking his pocket watch. The brass monument began to glow with that same cold inner light I had observed during my previous visit, but now the phenomenon was far more pronounced, the metal shining with an intensity that was almost painful to observe directly. And as we watched in fascinated horror, the figure of Brother Aelred began to move. It was not the crude animation of a puppet or automaton, but fluid, lifelike movement that seemed to breathe personality into the ancient brass. The monk's arms, previously raised in supplication or defense, now lowered slowly to his sides. His head actually turned, until his face was directed toward us with unmistakable awareness. "Dear God," breathed Whitmore, fumbling for his prayer book. The brass lips moved, and though no sound emerged, I could somehow understand the words being formed. "You have come, I have been waiting so long." The temperature plummeted even further, and our breath now came in great clouds of vapor. Frost began to form on the ancient stones, and icicles appeared with supernatural rapidity along the edges of the broken windows. Our torches flickered and dimmed, as if their very energy was being drained away by some invisible force. And then, with a sound like grinding millstones, the slab covering Brother Aelred's tomb began to move. It should have been impossible. The stone weighed at least half a ton, and had been sealed in place for centuries, yet it slid aside, as easily as if it were made of parchment, revealing beneath it not the expected grave goods and mouldering remains, but a dark opening that seemed to extend far deeper than any normal burial vault. From this aperture came a smell that defied description, not merely the mustiness of long-sealed spaces, but something actively corrupt, as if the very air had been poisoned by whatever lay beneath. And with the smell came sounds, rustling movements, whispered conversations in languages that predated Christianity, and beneath it all, a rhythmic chanting that seemed to pulse in time with some vast malevolent heartbeat. Whitmore was on his feet now, backing toward the chapter house entrance, while clutching his prayer book like a shield. "We must leave," he gasped, "now while we still can." But I found myself unable to move, transfixed by the terrible majesty of what was occurring before us. For this was no mere ghost story or peasant superstition, but something far more significant, tangible proof that the medieval chronicles spoke truth, that there were indeed forces in this world that science had not yet catalogued. The brass figure was now sitting upright on its slab, and as I watched, it began to rise further, as if the metal itself were becoming flesh. Features that had been mere suggestions in corroded copper now took on the appearance of living tissue, though tissue that had been corrupted by centuries of unnatural preservation. Brother Aelred, for I had no doubt that this was indeed he, fixed his eyes upon me with an expression of terrible intelligence. His mouth opened, and this time his voice was audible, though it seemed to come from everywhere at once, rather than from his apparent location. "Scholar," he said, and the word carried with it undertones of mockery and malice. "You have done well to release me from my bonds." The seals weakened with each disturbance, each touch of living hands upon my tomb. Now the work can at last be completed. What work? I found myself asking, though every instinct screamed at me to flee. The creature smiled, and in that expression I saw depths of evil that made my soul recoil in horror. "The work I began so long ago, before they discovered my experiments and imprisoned me in this place, the opening of doors that were meant to remain closed, the summoning of powers that will remake this world according to a darker design." Behind him, I could see movement in the opening that had been his grave, shapes that were neither wholly human nor entirely bestial, climbing toward the surface with eager anticipation, and in the distance, growing ever louder, came the sound of chanting from a choir that numbered not dozens, but hundreds of voices, all raised in blasphemous celebration. "You see," Brother Aelred continued, gesturing toward the emerging horrors, "death was but a temporary inconvenience. I made certain arrangements before my imprisonment, pacts that ensured my eventual return. All that was required was one living soul, willing to disturb my rest, to weaken the bindings that held me. You have served that purpose admirably." It was then that the true horror of my situation became clear. I had not stumbled upon this monument by chance, nor had my scholarly curiosity led me here by accident. I had been drawn, manipulated by forces I could not comprehend, made into an unwitting agent of something monstrous. "No," I whispered, backing away from the animated brass figure, "I won't be part of this." Brother Aelred laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "Too late for such protestations, scholar. The work is already done. The seals are broken, the barriers breached. Tonight, as the veil between worlds grows thin, my servants will walk the earth once more." As if to emphasize his words, the first of the creatures emerged fully from the tomb, a thing that might once have been human, but had been twisted into something altogether more terrible. It looked around the chapter house with eyes that burned like coals, then fixed its gaze upon me with unmistakable hunger. It was Whitmore who saved us both, in that moment of supreme peril, standing in the doorway of the chapter house, with his prayer book clutched in trembling hands. He began to recite, not the conventional prayers one might expect, but something far older and more potent, words in Latin that seemed to carry an authority that even these supernatural horrors were compelled to acknowledge. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Brother Aelred recoiled as if struck by a physical blow, and the creature emerging from the tomb let out a shriek of rage and pain. The cold light emanating from the brass began to flicker and dim, and the sounds of chanting from below grew discordant and uncertain. The binding words, Whitmore shouted over the supernatural cacophony, the ones inscribed on the original seal, they still have power. Indeed, as he continued his recitation, I could see the Latin words carved around the edge of the monument, beginning to glow with their own light, not the cold radiance of evil, but something warmer and more wholesome. The creatures trying to emerge from the tomb were driven back by this illumination, and Brother Aelred himself began to lose coherence, his animated form wavering like smoke in a strong wind. But the battle was far from over. With a final effort of will, the ancient monk gestured toward the opening of his tomb, and from its depths came a sound that was not quite music, and not quite speech, a rhythmic chanting in a language that predated human civilization. The temperature dropped even further, and the very stones of the chapter house began to crack and split under the supernatural pressure. "It's not enough," I shouted to Whitmore, "the binding is failing." But even as I spoke, I remembered something from my studies of medieval monasticism, something about the power of consecrated ground, and the particular efficacy of certain rites when performed in the presence of evil. Acting on desperate inspiration, I pulled from my satchel the rubbing I had made of Brother Aelred's monument, the damaged paper that had seemed to resist my efforts from the beginning. With hands that shook so violently, I could barely maintain my grip. I held the rubbing over one of the torches. The paper caught fire immediately, but instead of burning with ordinary flame, it blazed with the same warm light that now emanated from the carved Latin words. The effect upon Brother Aelred and his emerging servants was catastrophic. The ancient monk let out a scream that seemed to shake the very foundations of the abbey, and the creatures in the tomb fled back into the depths, as if pursued by avenging angels. The brass figure collapsed back onto its slab, once more becoming merely corroded metal, and the glow began to fade from both monument and burning paper. But I was not content to let the matter rest there. While the binding words still held their power, I began to gather up the scattered stones that had once concealed the monument, working with frantic haste to reseal the tomb. Whitmore joined me in this effort, and together we managed to drag the massive slab back into position over the opening. As the last stone settled into place, the supernatural manifestations ceased as abruptly as they had begun. The temperature in the chapter house began to rise toward normal levels, the unnatural sounds faded into silence, and our torches resumed their steady illumination. Yet the memory of what we had witnessed, and nearly unleashed upon the world, remained vivid in our shaken minds. Whitmore and I worked through the remainder of the night, using every stone we could move to pile upon Brother Aelred's tomb. By dawn, the monument was buried beneath a cairn that would have challenged a team of professional excavators to remove. But even this precaution seemed insufficient, given what we had learned of the ancient monk's power and malevolence. "The original seals," I said as we rested from our labors in the grey light of morning, "they were inscribed by the medieval brothers, men who understood the nature of what they were dealing with. We must find a way to renew those bindings." Whitmore nodded wearily. "There are records in the diocesan archives, formerly used in cases of suspected demonic activity, medieval exorcism rites, that might serve our purpose, but we would need ecclesiastical authority to perform such ceremonies." "Then, we must obtain such authority," I replied with more determination than I felt. "Whatever the cost, whatever explanations we must give, this evil cannot be allowed to escape again." The next several days passed in a blur of activity. Whitmore used his connections within the church hierarchy to arrange a meeting with the Bishop of Suffolk, while I travelled to London to consult with colleagues at the British Museum and the Royal Archaeological Institute. The story I told was carefully edited, focusing on the historical significance of the monument, while omitting the more supernatural aspects of our experience. Yet even these truncated accounts were met with considerable skepticism. The idea that a medieval burial site might require active containment struck most of my academic colleagues as medievalist fantasy, and I began to understand why previous investigators had kept their discoveries secret. Who would believe such a tale without witnessing the manifestations themselves? It was the bishop who proved most receptive to our concerns, though I suspected this had more to do with Whitmore's reputation for level-headedness than with any particular credulity on his lordship's part. A preliminary investigation was authorized, conducted by a small team of ecclesiastical historians and archaeological specialists who were sworn to discretion. What they found in the Diocesan archives proved both illuminating and disturbing. The case of Brother Aelred was far from unique. The medieval church had dealt with numerous instances of what they termed persistent spiritual corruption, employing specific rites and formulae to contain malevolent influences that ordinary death could not dispel. More significantly, these cases seemed to follow certain patterns that suggested genuine supernatural activity rather than mere superstition. The binding ritual that had originally sealed Brother Aelred's tomb was reconstructed from fragmentary documents dating to the 14th century. It required the cooperation of 7 ordained clergy, the use of specific blessed substances, and the recitation of Latin formulae that had been preserved in the most restricted sections of the church's archives. The ceremony was performed on the Feast of All Saints, exactly 1 year after our terrifying encounter. The bishop himself presided, assisted by 6 other clerics, including Whitmore. While I observed from a respectful distance, the rite was conducted in daylight, with the chapter house surrounded by a cordon of church officials who had been briefed only on the need for absolute secrecy. The ritual itself was lengthy and complex, involving the consecration of the ground around the monument, the renewal of the carved binding words, and the application of blessed oils and waters to every stone of the cairn we had erected. Throughout the ceremony, I detected no supernatural manifestations, no drop in temperature, no unnatural sounds, no sense of malevolent presence. Yet, as the final words of the binding formula were spoken, I felt a subtle change in the atmosphere of the chapter house. The oppressive weight that had hung over the place since my first visit seemed to lift, and the ancient stones appeared to regain something of their original sacred character. Whatever evil had lurked beneath those stones was now, I hoped, securely contained once more. In the weeks that followed the binding ceremony, I remained at Gormley Abbey to complete my study of the other monuments in the chapter house. The work proceeded without incident, and I was able to produce detailed rubbings and descriptions of the remaining brasses, a collection that proved to be of considerable archaeological significance. Yet I found it impossible to forget the horrors we had witnessed, or the knowledge that such forces could still exist in our modern rational world. The experience had shaken my faith in the supremacy of scientific materialism, forcing me to acknowledge that there were aspects of reality that lay beyond the reach of conventional scholarship. Whitmore, too, was profoundly affected by our encounter. In the months that followed, he threw himself into research on medieval demonology and ecclesiastical containment procedures, becoming something of an unofficial expert on what the church euphemistically termed spiritual anomalies. His parish work continued as before, but I detected in his sermons a new appreciation for the reality of evil and the necessity of vigilance against its manifestations. The official report on our investigation was classified at the highest levels of church hierarchy, with copies secured in the Vatican's secret archives and the private vaults of Canterbury Cathedral. The existence of Brother Aelred's monument was carefully omitted from all published accounts of Gormley Abbey, and the chapter house itself was quietly redesignated as unsafe for public access. Yet I could not bring myself to abandon the subject entirely. In the privacy of my Cambridge study, I began to compile a comprehensive account of our experience, documenting every detail while the memories remained fresh. This narrative I intended as a warning to future scholars who might encounter similar phenomena, a guide that might help them avoid the errors that had nearly cost us so dearly. For I had learned to my cost that the antiquarian's natural curiosity can lead one into realms where scholarship becomes deadly, and where the pursuit of knowledge may unleash forces better left undisturbed. The medieval chroniclers, who wrote of Brother Aelred's crimes, had not been recording superstition or allegory, but literal truth, evil of such magnitude that it could survive bodily death, seeking always for opportunities to complete its blasphemous work. The binding ritual appeared to have been successful. No further manifestations were reported from Gormley Abbey, and the chapter house gradually acquired the peaceful atmosphere appropriate to a religious ruin. Yet I remained haunted by Brother Aelred's final words, his confidence that the work would eventually be completed. How many other such monuments existed, scattered across the medieval landscape of Europe? How many contained similar threats, awaiting only the touch of an unwary scholar to weaken their ancient seals? These questions drove me to expand my research, corresponding with colleagues across the continent who had encountered anomalous archaeological sites. The responses I received were disturbing in their consistency. Fragmentary accounts of excavations, abandoned due to atmospheric disturbances, of monuments that seemed to resist proper documentation, of research teams that had dispersed suddenly and refused to discuss their findings. A pattern emerged from these scattered reports, suggesting that Brother Aelred had not been unique. The medieval church had apparently dealt with numerous cases of supernatural corruption, developing sophisticated procedures for containment and binding. Many of these ancient seals remained in place, but others had been weakened by time, neglect, or the well-meaning interventions of modern archaeology. I began to compile a catalogue of such sites, noting their locations and the specific precautions that might be required for their safe investigation. This work brought me into contact with a small but growing network of scholars who had encountered similar phenomena, archaeologists, historians, and clergy who had learned to recognize the signs of genuine supernatural activity. We formed an informal association, meeting periodically to share information and coordinate our research. Our goal was not to seek out such sites for study, but rather to identify and monitor them, ensuring that appropriate precautions were maintained. We called ourselves, with perhaps unconscious irony, the Antiquarian Society for the Preservation of Historical Integrity. It was through this network that I learned of other attempts to disturb Brother Aelred's tomb. Despite our precautions, rumors of the monument's existence had somehow leaked into the wider archaeological community. In 1967, a team from Oxford attempted to excavate the chapter house, but their work was quickly terminated after several team members reported severe psychological disturbances. More recently, a group of amateur enthusiasts had been discovered attempting to remove stones from our carefully constructed cairn, though they fled when confronted by church authorities. Each of these incidents served to reinforce my conviction that Brother Aelred's evil was far from dormant. The binding ritual had contained his influence, but it had not destroyed it. Like a malignant growth in remission, it waited for any opportunity to resume its deadly growth. This ongoing threat weighed heavily upon my mind as I entered the final decades of my career. I had devoted my life to the study of the past, believing that knowledge was inherently beneficial and that all historical truth should be brought to light. My experience at Gormley Abbey had taught me otherwise, that there were some secrets better left buried, some knowledge too dangerous to pursue. Yet the scholar's instinct is not easily suppressed. Even as I warned others away from Brother Aelred's monument, I found myself returning to the chapter house at irregular intervals, drawn by a compulsion I could neither explain nor entirely resist. These visits were always brief and conducted with elaborate precautions, but they served to reassure me that the ancient seals remained intact. On my final visit to Gormley Abbey, for I am now too old for such expeditions, I noticed something that filled me with deep unease. The stones of our cairn had shifted slightly, not enough to expose the monument beneath, but sufficient to suggest that some force was working to dislodge them. The carved Latin words that had blazed with holy light during our encounter were now barely visible, worn smooth by weather and time. The bindings were weakening. I reported this observation to the current Bishop of Suffolk, emphasizing the need for renewed vigilance and possibly another binding ceremony, but I fear that the modern church, for all its good intentions, lacks the knowledge and conviction of its medieval predecessors. The procedures we employed were reconstructed from fragmentary sources and may prove insufficient for permanent containment. This uncertainty haunts my declining years. I have done what I could to warn future generations, but I cannot guarantee that these warnings will be heeded. The attraction of forbidden knowledge is too strong, the skepticism of modern scholarship too ingrained. Someone, someday, will decide that Brother Aelred's monument deserves proper study, and will approach it with the confidence of contemporary archaeological methods. When that day comes, as I fear it must, I can only hope that they will be better prepared than I was for what they may encounter. For the evil that lies beneath those stones is patient and cunning, feeding upon human curiosity and ambition. It will wait as long as necessary for its next opportunity, growing stronger with each passing year. And when it finally breaks free from its ancient bonds, I fear that all our modern knowledge and technology will prove as ineffective as medieval prayers and holy water, for we are dealing with forces that predate civilization itself, powers that view human progress as merely another tool to be exploited in their eternal war against the light. This then is my testament and my warning. Let those who come after learn from my errors, and let them approach the monuments of the past with proper reverence for the dangers they may conceal. Some doors once opened can never be fully closed again. Some knowledge, once gained, can never be forgotten. And some evils, once awakened, will never rest until they have completed their apocalyptic work. I had hoped that my account would end with the successful binding of Brother Aelred's malevolent spirit, but I am compelled by conscience to record one final disturbing episode that occurred some 15 years after our original encounter. It serves as a stark reminder that evil of such magnitude is not easily contained, and that human folly remains its most reliable ally. The incident began innocuously enough, with a letter from a young doctoral candidate at Cambridge, named Jennifer Moorcock. Miss Moorcock was researching medieval monastic burial practices for her dissertation, and had somehow learned of my work at Gormley Abbey, though not, I was relieved to note, of the more supernatural aspects of that investigation. Her letter was professionally written, and demonstrated a thorough familiarity with the archaeological literature. She requested permission to examine my rubbings and notes from the Abbey, particularly those relating to what she termed nonconformist burial practices, presumably a reference to Brother Aelred's monument, though she did not mention him by name. I was immediately suspicious. Despite our efforts to suppress knowledge of the monument's existence, rumors had clearly persisted within certain academic circles. Moreover, Miss Moorcock's particular interest in nonconformist burials suggested that she had encountered some of the fragmentary historical references to Brother Aelred's case. I arranged to meet with her at my Cambridge rooms, hoping to determine the extent of her knowledge, and perhaps to dissuade her from pursuing this dangerous line of research. She proved to be an intelligent and determined young woman, with the kind of scholarly passion that I recognized from my own youth. This made her all the more dangerous, for such dedication could easily override considerations of personal safety. "Professor Ashton," she said, as we discussed her research over tea, "I'm particularly interested in cases where medieval burial practices deviated from established norms. The literature suggests that Gormley Abbey may have housed several such anomalous interments." I chose my words carefully. Medieval monastic communities did occasionally face unusual circumstances that required departures from conventional burial rites. However, I would question whether such cases offer sufficient material for doctoral research. The historical record is often fragmentary and unreliable. She leaned forward eagerly. "But that's precisely what makes them so fascinating. Take the case of the unnamed monk referenced in the Abbey Chronicle, the one who was buried with special precautions after his death in 1389. Surely such an unusual procedure deserves investigation." My blood ran cold. She knew of Brother Aelred, or at least knew enough to be dangerous. I realized that a direct approach was necessary. "Miss Moorcock," I said gravely, "I must ask you to abandon this particular line of research. There are aspects of the Gormley Abbey burials that are problematic in ways that extend beyond normal academic concerns." She regarded me with surprise. "I'm not sure I understand, Professor. Are you suggesting that there are ethical issues with studying these burials?" "I am suggesting," I replied, "that there are some historical subjects that are better left undisturbed. Not all knowledge is beneficial, and not all archaeological sites should be investigated." This warning, I could see, had precisely the opposite effect, from what I intended. Miss Moorcock's eyes lit up with the fervor of the true researcher, confronted with forbidden territory. I recognized the expression, because I had once worn it myself, standing in that same chapter house with Brother Aelred's monument gleaming before me. "Professor," she said softly, "are you telling me that you've encountered something at Gormley Abbey that cannot be explained by conventional archaeological methods?" I realized then that I had made a serious error by attempting to warn her away from the subject. I had instead confirmed her suspicions that something extraordinary was hidden at the Abbey. Her scholarly instincts, like mine, would never allow her to abandon such a tantalizing mystery. The remainder of our conversation was a delicate dance of revelation and concealment. I attempted to provide just enough information to satisfy her curiosity without revealing the true nature of what lay beneath Brother Aelred's monument. But Miss Moorcock was far too intelligent to be deflected by half-truths and evasions. She left my rooms that afternoon with a polite expression of gratitude for my time, but I could see in her manner that her determination had only been strengthened. I immediately wrote to Whitmore, warning him that another scholar was taking interest in the Abbey and suggesting that we should arrange for increased surveillance of the site. Whitmore's reply was deeply troubling. The church authorities who had been monitoring the Abbey reported several recent incidents of trespass, including evidence that someone had been systematically photographing the chapter house and attempting to measure the cairn of stones covering Brother Aelred's tomb. Moreover, local residents had again begun reporting strange sounds and lights emanating from the ruins during the dark hours. It seemed clear that Miss Moorcock had already begun her field work, despite my warnings. More ominously, her activities appeared to be having an effect upon the ancient seals that contained Brother Aelred's malevolence. The monitoring equipment, installed by church authorities, was detecting subtle but measurable fluctuations in electromagnetic fields around the chapter house, the same sort of anomalies that had preceded our own terrifying encounter. I attempted to contact Miss Moorcock directly, both through her college and at her lodgings, but she had apparently taken leave from her studies to pursue field research. Her supervisor knew only that she intended to spend several weeks studying monastic sites in East Anglia, with particular attention to Gormley Abbey. By the time Whitmore and I reached the Abbey, it was already too late. We arrived to find the chapter house in a state of considerable disturbance. The carefully arranged cairn of stones had been partially dismantled, with the displaced rocks forming neat piles that suggested systematic archaeological excavation. Modern surveying equipment was scattered about the chamber, along with the tools of professional archaeology, trowels, brushes, measuring devices, and photographic apparatus. Of Miss Moorcock herself, there was no immediate sign, though her notebook lay open beside Brother Aelred's monument, its pages covered with detailed measurements and sketches of the brass. The final entry, dated the previous evening, was particularly ominous. "The monument is far more complex than Professor Ashton's notes suggested. The brass appears to be of composite construction, with certain elements showing signs of deliberate modification. More significantly, there are traces of what appears to be deliberate damage, scratches and abrasions that seem to follow specific patterns, almost as if someone had attempted to alter the inscription or effigy after its installation. Tomorrow I will attempt to make a complete rubbing, which should reveal details invisible to casual observation." The notebook ended there, but the evidence of Miss Moorcock's fate was gruesomely apparent. The brass monument itself was now fully exposed, gleaming with that same cold inner light that had marked the beginning of our own supernatural encounter. But this time, the figure of Brother Aelred was not alone. Pressed into the metal beside the ancient monk's effigy was another form, clearly female, wearing modern clothing, with features that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the young scholar I had met in Cambridge. Miss Moorcock had become part of the monument itself, trapped forever in the same brass that contained her medieval predecessor. But the horror did not end there. As we watched in appalled fascination, the two figures began to move within their metallic prison. Brother Aelred turned toward his new companion with an expression of malevolent satisfaction, while Miss Moorcock's brass features twisted in silent screams of terror and despair. "Dear God," whispered Whitmore, reaching for his prayer book. "She's still alive in there, conscious, but unable to escape." Indeed, it seemed that this was Brother Aelred's preferred method of preserving his victims, not death. but an eternity of imprisonment within the metal confines of his monument. Miss Moorcock would remain forever trapped, her consciousness preserved, but her body transformed into mere decoration for the ancient monk's tomb. But even this abomination was not the full extent of the danger we faced. The partial excavation of the monument had weakened the binding seals sufficiently to allow other manifestations to begin. The familiar sounds of chanting were already audible from the depths of the tomb, and the temperature in the chapter house was dropping rapidly. Working with desperate haste, Whitmore and I began the process of recovering the monument, replacing the stones that Miss Moorcock had so carefully removed. But the damage was more extensive than we had initially realized. Several of the carved binding words had been deliberately chiseled away, apparently as part of Miss Moorcock's scholarly investigation, and without these crucial elements, the ancient seals could not function properly. We did what we could, using makeshift materials to approximate the missing Latin formulae, but I feared our efforts would prove insufficient. Brother Aelred's power had been considerably strengthened by the absorption of Miss Moorcock's life force, and the ancient bindings that had once contained him were now seriously compromised. As we worked, I became aware that the two figures in the brass were watching our efforts with evident amusement. Miss Moorcock's expression had now changed from terror to something resembling complicity, as if her consciousness had been corrupted by prolonged contact with Brother Aelred's evil. When our eyes met, she smiled, a cold, predatory expression that bore no resemblance to the eager young scholar I had known. We completed our repairs as best we could and retreated from the chapter house, but I held little hope that our measures would prove adequate. The seals were failing, and we lacked both the knowledge and the authority to renew them properly. Moreover, Brother Aelred now possessed a modern ally, someone familiar with contemporary archaeological methods and academic networks, who could guide him in adapting his ancient malevolence to the modern world. The implications were terrifying. Miss Moorcock's research had undoubtedly left traces in various academic databases and archives. Her disappearance would eventually be investigated, leading other scholars to the same dangerous conclusions that had driven her to Gormley Abbey. Each new investigator would represent another potential victim, another source of strength for the ancient evil. I realized then that my original strategy of secrecy and concealment had been fundamentally flawed. By attempting to suppress knowledge of Brother Aelred's existence, I had merely ensured that each new discoverer would approach the monument without adequate preparation or warning. The missing scholar would become a mystery that attracted even more attention, creating an endless cycle of investigation and victimization. In the days following our discovery of Miss Moorcock's fate, I found myself consumed by a desperate need to find some permanent solution to the threat posed by Brother Aelred's monument. The traditional church authorities, while sympathetic, seemed powerless to act decisively. Modern ecclesiastical hierarchy, for all its good intentions, lacked the absolute conviction of its medieval predecessors. It was while researching alternative approaches that I made a discovery that changed my understanding of the entire situation. Hidden within the archives of a disbanded monastic library, I found a document that revealed the true scope of Brother Aelred's crimes, and the reason why conventional binding rituals had proven inadequate to contain his evil. The manuscript, written in the hand of the medieval Abbot Walter, who had overseen Brother Aelred's original imprisonment, contained details that had been carefully excluded from the official chronicle. According to this secret account, Brother Aelred had not been merely a practitioner of forbidden arts, but something far more dangerous, a scholar who had succeeded in bridging the gap between medieval superstition and genuine supernatural forces. The monk Aelred, wrote Abbot Walter, did not content himself with the crude practices of village witches and hedge wizards, but sought instead to systematize the summoning of unclean spirits according to principles of natural philosophy. He compiled a great grimoire containing the true names and binding formulas of 77 demons, each of which he claimed to have successfully contacted and commanded. But his greatest crime was the creation of what he termed a perpetual covenant, a binding pact that would ensure his continued existence even after bodily death. By sacrificing 7 innocent souls according to specific ritual requirements, he purchased from the Prince of Darkness the promise of eternal life and ever-growing power. When we discovered his activities, 4 of the required sacrifices had already been completed. We prevented the completion of his hellish work only by the grace of Almighty God and the timely intervention of Brother Thomas, who died of his wounds after revealing the location of Aelred's hidden chamber. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Brother Aelred had not been contained by the original binding ritual because he was no ordinary spirit, but rather a being who had entered into formal compact with diabolic forces. His monument was not merely a tomb but a kind of spiritual anchor, designed to maintain his consciousness in the physical world until his interrupted work could be completed. More terrifying still was the realization that each new victim absorbed into the monument brought him closer to that goal. Miss Moorcock represented the fifth sacrifice, leaving only 2 more required to complete his original covenant. Once those final victims were claimed, Brother Aelred would achieve the full power promised by his diabolic patron, power sufficient to break free from any earthly constraint and begin the larger work of corruption he had planned. Armed with this knowledge, I began to understand why previous containment efforts had proven only temporary. Brother Aelred was not fighting the bindings passively, but actively working to undermine them through a combination of supernatural influence and carefully orchestrated coincidences. The scholars who had been drawn to investigate his monument were not random victims, but specifically chosen individuals whose unique knowledge or circumstances made them valuable additions to his collection. I myself had been selected for my expertise in medieval brass rubbings, skills that would prove essential for properly exposing and documenting his monument. Miss Moorcock had been chosen for a knowledge of modern archaeological techniques, which would allow him to adapt his methods to contemporary investigative approaches. Each victim contributed something unique to his growing capabilities. This pattern suggested that he was already selecting his 6th and 7th targets, individuals whose particular talents would complete the skill set required for his ultimate goals. The thought that even now, somewhere in England, 2 more innocent scholars might be experiencing the first subtle influences that would draw them to Gormley Abbey filled me with desperate urgency. But the medieval manuscript contained more than just historical revelations. Abbot Walter had also recorded the specific ritual procedures required for the permanent destruction of such a covenant. Unlike the binding ceremonies we had previously employed, this rite was designed not to contain the evil, but to sever the diabolic pact entirely, forcing Brother Aelred's consciousness back into whatever infernal realm had originally sustained it. The requirements were daunting. The ritual demanded the presence of 9 ordained priests, specific relics blessed by particular saints, and the recitation of formulae that had been deliberately obscured even in the secret manuscript. Moreover, the ceremony could only be performed at the moment of Brother Aelred's greatest vulnerability, when he was attempting to claim his final victims and complete his original covenant. Most challenging of all was the requirement for a willing sacrifice, someone who would knowingly place themselves in mortal danger to provide the necessary spiritual focus for the ritual. This individual would have to approach Brother Aelred's monument during his period of maximum power, deliberately exposing themselves to the same fate that had befallen Miss Moorcock, while trusting that the assembled clergy could complete the banishment before the ancient monk could claim his prize. I realized, with a mixture of terror and resignation, that I was the logical choice for this role. My previous encounters with Brother Aelred had given me some immunity to his influence, enough, perhaps, to approach the monument without immediately succumbing to its power. Moreover, my advanced age meant that I had less to lose than a younger scholar should the ritual fail. The task of assembling the required clergy proved surprisingly manageable. Word of our situation had spread through certain ecclesiastical circles, creating a network of believers who understood the reality of supernatural threats. Within a month, I had obtained commitments from 9 priests willing to participate in the dangerous ceremony, including a remarkable old Jesuit named Father Benedetti, who claimed extensive experience with anomalous spiritual phenomena. The necessary relics were more difficult to obtain, requiring delicate negotiations with various religious institutions and private collectors. Several items had to be borrowed under the pretext of scholarly research, while others were quietly purchased from dealers who specialized in ecclesiastical antiquities. I confess that I resorted to certain deceptions in acquiring these materials, but I reasoned that the ultimate goal justified such measures. The timing of our intervention was determined by Brother Aelred himself. Through carefully placed inquiries within the academic community, I learned that 2 more scholars had recently begun research projects that seemed likely to lead them to Gormley Abbey. Professor Marcus Whitley, of Oxford, was investigating anomalous medieval burial practices, while Dr. Sarah Chen, from the British Museum, had developed an interest in ecclesiastical brass monuments with unusual iconographic features. Both were exactly the sort of researchers who would be drawn inevitably to Brother Aelred's monument, and both possessed skills that would be valuable additions to his growing collection. Professor Whitley's expertise in medieval Latin would help him decipher the more obscure portions of the binding inscriptions, while Dr. Chen's knowledge of metallurgy might allow him to understand the supernatural processes that had created his brass prison. I made discreet attempts to warn both scholars away from their research, but as expected, my efforts only served to confirm their suspicions that something extraordinary was hidden at the Abbey. Within a fortnight, both had applied for research permits to excavate the chapter house, and I realized that our window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The ritual was scheduled for the night of All Hallows' Eve, the anniversary of Brother Aelred's original exposure, and traditionally, the time when the barriers between worlds grew thinnest. Our hope was that the same conditions that enhanced his power might also make him more vulnerable to the banishment ceremony. As the appointed night approached, I found myself reviewing my life with the detached perspective of a man facing probable death. I had devoted decades to the study of the past, believing that all knowledge was inherently valuable and that the truth should always be brought to light. My encounter with Brother Aelred had taught me otherwise, that there were some secrets too dangerous to preserve, some knowledge too corrupting to possess. Yet even now, standing on the threshold of what might be my final scholarly endeavor, I could not entirely suppress the antiquarian's instinct for discovery. What would I learn in those final moments, before Brother Aelred claimed his prize? What insights into the nature of evil and the structure of reality might be revealed to one who approached so close to ultimate corruption? Such thoughts, I realized, were themselves evidence of the ancient monk's influence. Even his intended victims served his purposes, driven by the same scholarly curiosity that had originally led me to disturb his rest. The pursuit of forbidden knowledge was both the means of his influence and the mechanism of his revenge, a perfect trap for minds that could not resist the allure of ultimate understanding. The night of All Hallows' Eve, 1982, was bitter cold and moonless, conditions that Father Benedetti assured me were ideal for our purposes. The old evil draws strength from lunar influences, he explained as we made our final preparations in the vestry of Ashford St. Mary. On a night such as this, when the natural world turns inward upon itself, supernatural forces must rely entirely upon their own accumulated power. The 9 priests, who had assembled for our desperate undertaking, represented a remarkable variety of ecclesiastical traditions. Besides Whitmore and Father Benedetti, we had secured the participation of a Greek Orthodox archimandrite, 2 Anglican canons with experience in spiritual warfare, a Benedictine abbot whose monastery specialized in medieval manuscripts, a Jesuit scholar of comparative demonology, a Methodist minister who had written extensively on supernatural phenomena, and most unusually, a Catholic bishop who had been quietly removed from his see after reporting encounters with what he termed persistent diabolic manifestations. Each had brought with him the specific relics and sacred implements required by Abbot Walter's ancient formula. The collection was impressive in its scope: fragments of the true cross, bones of various saints, holy oils blessed by 3 different popes, and a copy of the Gospel of St. John that had supposedly belonged to Thomas Becket himself. Whether any of these items possessed genuine supernatural properties, I could not say, but their combined symbolic weight was undeniably powerful. Our approach to the Abbey was conducted in absolute silence, each man wrapped in his own prayers and preparations. The ruins, when we reached them, seemed somehow more desolate than I had ever seen them, as if the very stones were aware of the approaching confrontation and had withdrawn whatever residual sanctity they possessed. The chapter house itself was unchanged from our last visit, save that the carefully arranged cairn of stones now showed clear signs of recent disturbance. Someone, undoubtedly one of Brother Aelred's intended victims, had been at work here, systematically removing the protective barriers we had erected. "It has begun," murmured Father Benedetti, studying the scattered stones with professional interest. "The final phase of his plan. He is drawing them here, even now." Indeed, as we established our ritual circle around the partially exposed monument, I could see lights moving in the distance, torches or lanterns carried by figures approaching through the ruins. Professor Whitley and Dr. Chen were arriving for their fateful appointment, drawn by compulsions they could neither understand nor resist. The priests took their appointed positions around the chapter house, each at a point determined by careful measurement and astronomical calculation. The ritual circle encompassed not only Brother Aelred's monument, but the entire chamber, creating what Father Benedetti termed a spiritual containment field that would, we hoped, prevent the ancient monk's influence from extending beyond the immediate area. As the distant lights drew closer, I took my own position directly beside the monument, close enough to touch the exposed brass effigy. My role was perhaps the most crucial of all, to serve as both bait and anchor, drawing Brother Aelred's attention while providing the priests with a fixed point upon which to focus their banishment ritual. The first sign of supernatural activity came as a sudden drop in temperature, so severe that our breath immediately began to mist in the frigid air. The brass monument started to glow with that familiar cold radiance, and I could feel the metal growing warm beneath the accumulated frost, a paradoxical sensation that spoke of energies drawn from realms beyond normal physical law. Brother Aelred's effigy began to stir, the ancient brass flowing like liquid metal as his form took on the semblance of life. But this time, his awakening was accompanied by another movement. The figure of Miss Moorcock, trapped forever in the monument beside her captor, also began to animate. Her brass features turned toward me with an expression of desperate warning, her metal lips moving soundlessly as she attempted to communicate some crucial message. The priests had begun their chanting now, not the corrupted plainsong I had heard during previous manifestations, but something older and more authoritative. The Latin words seemed to carry physical weight, pressing down upon the supernatural forces gathering within the chapter house. Yet I could feel Brother Aelred's power growing stronger as his intended victims approached, fed by their proximity and their unknowing participation in his centuries-old plan. Professor Whitley was the first to enter the chapter house, his face bearing the blank expression of one moving under external compulsion. He carried a bag of archaeological tools and moved with the mechanical precision of a sleepwalker, stepping carefully around the kneeling priests as if they were merely another obstacle to be navigated. Dr. Chen followed moments later, equally entranced, her own equipment bag clutched in hands that seemed to move independently of her conscious will. Both scholars approached the monument with expressions of eager anticipation, their eyes fixed upon the glowing brass with the intensity of addiction. It was then that Brother Aelred spoke, his voice emerging not from the brass effigy, but from the air itself, surrounding us with its malevolent presence. "Fools, do you think your medieval mumbling can undo what was sealed with diabolic authority? I have waited 7 centuries for this moment. Tonight, my covenant is completed, and the powers promised me shall be mine to command." The brass figure was now fully animate, sitting upright upon its slab with movements that seemed startlingly lifelike. But it was Miss Moorcock's trapped form that commanded my attention, for her soundless lips were clearly forming a single word, repeated over and over with desperate urgency: name. Of course, the banishment ritual required the speaking of Brother Aelred's true name, not the monastic designation by which he was commonly known, but the birth name that bound his essence to the physical world. Without this crucial element, all our preparations would prove useless. But how could I learn a name that had been deliberately erased from all historical records? The medieval church had been thorough in its efforts to consign Brother Aelred to anonymity, understanding instinctively that names held power over those who bore them. The answer came to me in a flash of inspiration born from decades of antiquarian research. Medieval monks, whatever their later crimes, had all been baptized children once recorded in the parish registers of their birth villages. If I could determine Brother Aelred's origins, working with desperate haste, while the priests maintained their chanting circle, I pulled out my notebook and began to calculate. The abbey records indicated that Brother Aelred had entered the monastery in 1365 as a young man of perhaps 20 years. This would place his birth around 1345, in the terrible years following the Black Death, when entire villages had been depopulated. But there was another clue: the unusual dialect in which parts of his memorial inscription had been carved. This suggested origins in the northern reaches of the county, where distinctive linguistic features had persisted even into the 14th century. Only 3 parishes in that region had maintained continuous records through the plague years. As I worked through these calculations, the supernatural drama around me was reaching its climax. Professor Whitley and Dr. Chen had reached the monument and were kneeling beside it in attitudes of worship, their hands already beginning to show the metallic discoloration that marked the beginning of their transformation into brass. Brother Aelred's laughter filled the chapter house as he prepared to claim his final victims and complete his diabolic covenant. The priests chanting had become almost frantic, their voices raised in desperate supplication as they felt their ritual beginning to fail. Without the true name, their banishment formula lacked the specific focus required to sever Brother Aelred's supernatural bonds. It was then that Miss Moorcock's brass lips formed a different word, not name, but Edmund. Her metallic features smiled with relief as she saw my recognition, and I realized that she had somehow retained enough awareness to recall details from her own research into the Abbey's history. "Edmund," I shouted, my voice cutting through both the priestly chanting and Brother Aelred's triumphant laughter. "Edmund de Norwell, born in the parish of Stow Bardolph, in the year of our Lord, 1345, baptized on the feast of Saint Michael, and confirmed in the faith of Christ Jesus." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Brother Aelred's brass form recoiled, as if struck by a physical blow, his confident expression replaced by one of shock and rage. The metal of the monument began to smoke and bubble, as if subjected to intense heat, and the cold radiance that had surrounded him flickered and dimmed. "You know nothing of what you meddle with," he snarled, but I could hear uncertainty in his voice now. The speaking of his true name had broken some crucial element of his protection, making him vulnerable to the banishment ritual in ways he had not anticipated. Father Benedetti seized upon this advantage, modifying the ritual chant to incorporate the name I had discovered. The other priests followed his lead, their voices now united in a powerful formula that combined Brother Aelred's true identity with the binding words of banishment. The ancient monk fought back with desperate fury, his brass form beginning to expand and distort as he called upon reserves of power accumulated over 7 centuries. The chapter house shook with supernatural force, stones falling from the walls as reality itself seemed to strain under the pressure of our confrontation. But the tide had turned. With his true name spoken and incorporated into the banishment ritual, Brother Aelred found his connection to the physical world growing progressively weaker. The brass monument began to crack and split, releasing clouds of metallic vapor that swirled around the chamber like living smoke. Miss Moorcock's figure too was beginning to change, but in her case, the transformation was clearly one of liberation rather than destruction. The brass that had imprisoned her was dissolving away, revealing glimpses of her original human form beneath. She looked at me with expressions of profound gratitude, as her consciousness prepared to depart for whatever realm awaited the innocent dead. Professor Whitley and Dr. Chen, their own transformation barely begun, suddenly collapsed as Brother Aelred's influence over them was severed. They lay unconscious, but breathing, their hands slowly returning to normal flesh tone as the metallic contamination faded from their systems. Brother Aelred himself was now clearly losing cohesion, his form wavering between brass and shadow as the banishment ritual reached its climax. Yet even in defeat, his malevolence remained undiminished. "This is not the end," he raged, his voice growing fainter, but no less venomous. "Others will come. Others will seek the knowledge I have gathered. The work will continue, even if I am not here to oversee it." With these words, he gestured toward a section of the chapter house wall that I had never previously noticed, a collection of carved stones that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. As I watched in horror, I realized that these were not random architectural elements, but rather a deliberate arrangement, a kind of supernatural library, where Brother Aelred had inscribed the essence of his accumulated knowledge. The diabolic grimoire mentioned in Abbot Walter's secret manuscript had not been a physical book at all, but rather this collection of stone tablets, each one carved with formulas and incantations that could survive any physical destruction of the abbey itself. Even with Brother Aelred banished, his knowledge would remain, waiting for the next scholar curious enough to decipher its meaning. But there was no time to address this new revelation. The banishment ritual was reaching its conclusion, and Brother Aelred's form was dissolving into mist and shadow with a final shriek of rage that seemed to echo from the very foundations of the earth. He vanished, leaving behind only the cracked remains of his brass monument and the lingering smell of sulfur and corruption. The chapter house fell silent, save for our labored breathing and the distant sound of wind through the ruins. Miss Moorcock's freed spirit had already departed, but not before favoring me with a final smile of thanks. The immediate danger was over. Brother Aelred had been banished to whatever infernal realm had originally spawned him. Yet, as I looked upon those carved stones with their burden of forbidden knowledge, I realized that our victory was at best temporary. The ancient monk's legacy would endure, waiting for the next generation of scholars to discover its secrets. And when that day came, as it inevitably would, someone would have to stand guard once more against the powers that mankind was never meant to command. The aftermath of Brother Aelred's banishment brought both relief and new responsibilities that I had not anticipated. Professor Whitley and Dr. Chen recovered from their ordeal with no memory of the supernatural events that had nearly claimed them, a mercy for which I was profoundly grateful. Both attributed their temporary blackouts to exhaustion and stress, accepting without question the cover story we provided about their rescue from a collapse in the chapter house. The priests who had participated in the banishment ritual dispersed quietly to their various appointments, bound by solemn oaths never to speak of what they had witnessed. Father Benedetti remained for several additional days, helping us to assess the spiritual state of the abbey and determine what further precautions might be necessary. It was he who first drew my attention to the true scope of the problem we now faced. Brother Aelred's carved stone library represented knowledge that was arguably more dangerous than the monk himself had been. Where his personal malevolence had been focused and containable, these inscribed formulas were potentially accessible to anyone with sufficient learning to decipher their meaning. We cannot simply wall them up or bury them, Father Benedetti explained as we examined the sinister carvings by torchlight. Such knowledge has a way of calling out to receptive minds, drawing them like a lodestone draws iron. No physical barrier will prove sufficient against its attraction. The alternative he proposed was both elegant and terrifying in its implications. Rather than attempting to destroy or conceal Brother Aelred's legacy, we would establish a permanent watch over it, a line of guardians who would monitor the site and intercept any scholars who might be drawn to investigate its secrets. It has been done before, he assured me, though rarely on such a scale. There are monasteries in Tibet that guard certain texts for precisely this reason, and I know of at least 3 sites in Europe where similar vigils are maintained. The key is to ensure continuity. Each guardian must train his successor in the necessary knowledge and precautions. The proposal meant abandoning my comfortable retirement to become a permanent resident near Gormley Abbey, dedicating my remaining years to a task that offered no recognition and little hope of ultimate success. Yet what alternative did I have? I had been present at Brother Aelred's awakening and his banishment. I possessed knowledge of his methods and goals that could prove crucial in recognizing future threats. Moreover, I felt a peculiar sense of responsibility for what had occurred. My own scholarly curiosity had initiated the chain of events that led to Miss Moorcock's death and the near completion of Brother Aelred's diabolic covenant. Having disturbed this ancient evil, I was morally obligated to ensure that it remained contained. Whitmore, when I explained my decision to him, was both understanding and supportive. The church can provide certain resources, he assured me, though they must be carefully disguised to avoid unwanted attention. A small trust fund, perhaps, established to support ongoing archaeological monitoring of the site, enough to maintain a modest residence and basic research facilities. The arrangements took several months to finalize, but by the spring of 1983, I had established myself in a cottage within sight of the abbey ruins. The building had formerly housed the estate manager for a long-vanished manor, and its position offered excellent observation of all approaches to the chapter house, while maintaining the appearance of ordinary rural retirement. My new role required the development of entirely new skills. I became proficient in surveillance techniques, learning to monitor academic databases and publication schedules for any research that might touch upon Brother Aelred's sphere of influence. I established correspondence with librarians and archivists across Europe, creating a network of informants who would alert me to unusual requests for materials related to medieval demonology or anomalous burial practices. Most challenging of all was the development of intervention strategies, methods for discouraging dangerous research without creating the kind of forbidden mystery that would only intensify scholarly interest. Sometimes a strategic loss of documents or the circulation of convincing forgeries was sufficient to redirect a researcher's attention. In more persistent cases, I found it necessary to arrange for competing opportunities, fellowship offers, or teaching positions that would draw potential investigators away from their perilous inquiries. The work was lonely and frustrating, offering none of the intellectual satisfaction that had driven my previous career. I was forced to suppress knowledge rather than advance it, to conceal truth rather than reveal it. Yet gradually, I came to understand that this too was a form of scholarship, a recognition that wisdom sometimes lay in knowing what questions should not be asked. Over the years, I intercepted dozens of potential investigators, each drawn by fragments of the Brother Aelred story that had somehow survived our efforts at suppression. Some were easily discouraged, but others required more elaborate measures. I became adept at manufacturing plausible explanations for the anomalous elements they had discovered. Clerical errors in transcription, mistranslation of ambiguous Latin phrases, or confusion between different medieval figures of similar name. The most dangerous cases were those involving researchers who had already begun to experience supernatural influences. These individuals often displayed a driven quality that made them resistant to ordinary dissuasion, and their investigations frequently proceeded with the kind of uncanny efficiency that suggested external guidance. In such instances, I was forced to employ more direct methods, sometimes staging accidents or emergencies that would force the abandonment of field work, occasionally even resorting to theft or sabotage of crucial equipment. I documented all of these interventions carefully, maintaining detailed records that would assist my eventual successor in understanding the patterns of supernatural influence and the methods most effective in countering them. This archive grew to encompass several filing cabinets of material, case studies, correspondence, and theoretical analyses that represented the world's most comprehensive collection of practical demonological countermeasures. Yet despite my vigilance, I was always aware that my guardianship was necessarily temporary. Age was taking its inevitable toll, and I could not maintain this watch indefinitely. The question of succession became increasingly urgent as my 70th birthday approached and my physical capabilities began to decline. Father Benedetti had remained in periodic contact throughout my years of guardianship, and it was he who proposed a solution to the succession problem. The Jesuit order, he informed me, maintained a small but highly trained cadre of specialists in what they euphemistically termed anomalous spiritual phenomena. These individuals, selected for their combination of scholarly ability and psychological stability, were specifically prepared to handle situations like the one at Gormley Abbey. Brother Marcus has been studying your reports with great interest, Father Benedetti explained during one of his visits to my cottage. He possesses advanced degrees in both medieval history and comparative theology, along with extensive field experience in similar cases. I believe he would make an excellent successor to your guardianship. Brother Marcus proved to be a surprisingly young man, barely 40, with the lean build and intense eyes of a scholar warrior. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of medieval demonological literature, and spoke with casual familiarity of cases I had thought unique to Gormley Abbey. Most reassuring of all, he displayed none of the burning curiosity that had driven both myself and Miss Moorcock to our disastrous encounters with Brother Aelred's monument. I am not here to study the entity you contained, he assured me during our first extended conversation. I am here to ensure that it remains contained, nothing more. The Jesuit archives contain quite enough dangerous knowledge already. We have no need to add to the collection. The transfer of responsibility took place gradually over the course of a full year, during which Brother Marcus observed my methods and familiarized himself with the specific challenges posed by the Gormley Abbey site. He proved remarkably adept at the subtle arts of scholarly misdirection, and I was particularly impressed by his ability to identify potential threats before they developed into serious problems. By the autumn of 1989, I felt confident that the guardianship was in capable hands. Brother Marcus had already intercepted 2 potentially dangerous investigations and had established his own network of academic contacts. The cottage was well supplied with surveillance equipment and communication devices, and the church had provided sufficient funding to ensure continuity of operations for at least another generation. On my final night as guardian, I walked once more through the abbey ruins, visiting each location where I had encountered Brother Ulred's influence. The chapter house was peaceful in the moonlight, showing no trace of the supernatural drama that had once unfolded within its walls. The carefully reconstructed cairn over the monument remained undisturbed, and the carved stones containing his knowledge showed no sign of their sinister significance. Yet I remained conscious that this tranquility was maintained only through constant vigilance. Brother Aelred had been banished, not destroyed, and his accumulated knowledge remained as potent as ever. Somewhere in the realm to which we had consigned him, he undoubtedly continued to plot his return, seeking new methods of influence and corruption. The thought no longer filled me with the terror it once had. I had spent 6 years learning to live with the reality of supernatural evil, and I had discovered that even the most ancient horrors could be contained by human dedication and divine grace. The guardianship would continue, passing from one generation to the next, as long as there remained those willing to stand watch against the darkness. As I prepared to leave Gormley Abbey for the final time, I reflected upon the strange career that had brought me from the comfortable world of academic antiquarianism to this unlikely role as sentinel against diabolic knowledge. It had not been the life I had planned, or the legacy I had hoped to leave, yet I felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that my efforts had helped to preserve the world from influences it was not prepared to face. The inscription I had chosen for my own eventual memorial was appropriately modest. Here lies one who learned that some secrets are too dangerous to preserve. It was a lesson that had cost me a promising scholarly career, and Miss Moorcock her life, but it was knowledge that might yet prove crucial for future generations of researchers. For the pursuit of truth, however noble in intent, must always be tempered by wisdom about what truths are safe to pursue, and sometimes, as I had learned to my cost, the greatest service a scholar can perform is not to reveal knowledge, but to ensure that certain knowledge remains hidden forever. From the private papers of Brother Marcus Antonius, S.J., Guardian of Gormley Abbey, written on the Feast of All Saints, 2023, it has now been 34 years since I assumed responsibility for maintaining the watch over Brother Aelred's legacy, and I find myself compelled to add a final chapter to Professor Ashton's remarkable account. The old scholar lived to see his 90th birthday, spending his final years in peaceful retirement at a Benedictine monastery in Wales, where he found solace in the ordered rhythms of monastic life. His death in 1995 was gentle. He simply failed to wake one autumn morning, his face bearing an expression of profound peace that suggested his troubled soul had finally found rest. The guardianship he established has proved remarkably effective, though not without its challenges. The digital age has brought new complications to our work, as information that was once safely buried in obscure manuscripts can now be shared instantaneously across the globe. Social media platforms and academic databases have created unprecedented opportunities for dangerous knowledge to spread beyond our ability to contain it. Yet, technology has also provided new tools for monitoring and intervention. Automated search algorithms alert me to any online discussion of Gormley Abbey or Brother Aelred, while carefully crafted disinformation campaigns help to discredit genuine discoveries before they can gain traction. The art of Guardian has evolved, but its essential purpose remains unchanged. The most serious challenge came in 2019, when a team of paranormal investigators, equipped with sophisticated recording equipment, attempted to conduct an overnight vigil in the chapter house. Their preliminary research had been remarkably thorough, incorporating elements of Professor Ashton's suppressed publications, along with material from medieval sources I had thought successfully contained. The intervention required all of my accumulated skills, along with assistance from colleagues across 3 continents. We were ultimately successful in discrediting their findings and preventing the broadcast of their recorded evidence, but the incident served as a stark reminder that Brother Aelred's influence extends far beyond the physical boundaries of the Abbey ruins. For the truth that Professor Ashton discovered, and that I have spent decades confirming, is that evil of this magnitude does not remain passively contained. The The knowledge inscribed in those ancient stones continues to call out to receptive minds, its influence growing stronger as each passing century weakens the barriers between the physical and spiritual realms. The banishment of Brother Aelred himself was merely the first step in what may prove to be an eternal struggle. I have identified at least 37 similar sites across Europe and the Near East, locations where comparable diabolic covenants were established and subsequently contained by vigilant guardians. Most are maintained by religious orders like my own, though a few have passed into the hands of secular organizations that understand the magnitude of what they protect. We form an invisible network of sentinels, sharing information and resources in a war that the wider world must never know is being fought. The pattern is always the same, ancient knowledge preserved in hidden forms, calling out across the centuries to those whose curiosity outweighs their caution. Scholars, researchers, amateur enthusiasts, all drawn by the promise of discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding, none realizing that some understanding comes at a price that no mortal soul should pay. My own successor is already in training, a brilliant young woman from the Vatican's secretive archive of anomalous phenomena, whose combination of scholarly rigor and spiritual discipline marks her as ideally suited for this work. Sister Catherine possesses advanced degrees in medieval history and theoretical physics, along with fluency in 17 languages, including several that are no longer spoken by the living. More importantly, she has demonstrated the crucial ability to resist the allure of forbidden knowledge, understanding instinctively that some doors should never be opened. The transfer of guardianship will take place next year, on the 40th anniversary of Professor Ashton's banishment of Brother Aelred. The timing is significant. Our monitoring equipment has detected increased electromagnetic activity around the chapter house, suggesting that the ancient monk's influence is somehow growing stronger as the anniversary approaches. We have observed similar patterns at other contained sites, leading some of our theologians to theorize that diabolic covenants may be subject to cyclical variations in power. Sister Catherine will face challenges that neither Professor Ashton nor I could have anticipated. Climate change is altering the physical structure of ancient sites, while political instability threatens the institutional frameworks that have maintained these guardianships for centuries. Most troubling of all, the rise of artificial intelligence presents unprecedented opportunities for the rapid analysis and dissemination of dangerous information. Yet I remain confident that the watch will continue. The human capacity for wisdom, the ability to recognize that some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, has proved remarkably resilient across the centuries. Each generation produces individuals willing to sacrifice personal ambition for the greater good, to stand guard against forces that would corrupt or destroy the world they seek to protect. As I write these words, autumn mist is beginning to gather around the abbey ruins, and I can hear in the distance the sound that has become so familiar over the decades, a faint, rhythmic chanting that emerges from the stones themselves on certain nights when atmospheric conditions are precisely right. It is not Brother Aelred's voice, for he has been banished beyond the reach of earthly influence. Rather, it is the accumulated echo of centuries of monastic prayer, the spiritual resonance of countless souls who dedicated their lives to holding darkness at bay. The sound reminds me that our guardianship is part of a much larger tradition, a chain of watchers stretching back through history to the very beginning of human civilization. We are the heirs of temple guardians and monastery librarians, of scholars and mystics who understood that knowledge without wisdom is the path to damnation. Brother Aelred sought to unlock secrets that would have remade the world according to his corrupted vision. He failed, as all such attempts must ultimately fail, because there will always be those willing to stand against the darkness. The watch continues, the guardians remain at their posts, and the ancient seals hold firm against the forces they were designed to contain. This is our covenant, not with diabolic powers, but with the light that opposes them. We who guard the forbidden knowledge do so not for personal gain or scholarly glory, but because we understand that some prices are too high to pay, some truths too dangerous to reveal. The chapter house stands empty in the moonlight, its broken walls, testament to the transience of human ambition. But beneath those stones, held fast by bonds of prayer and sacrifice, the ancient darkness waits with infinite patience for its next opportunity, and we who know of its presence maintain our eternal vigil, guardians of a secret that must never be allowed to escape. The watch continues. The watch must always continue. Finis. Thus concludes the brass rubbing at Gormley Abbey, being a true and faithful account of certain supernatural events that occurred in the county of Suffolk during the years 1981 to 1989, as recorded by Professor Edmund Ashton, Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, and confirmed by subsequent investigations conducted under the auspices of the Society of Jesus. Let those who read these words take warning, and let them remember that the pursuit of knowledge, however noble in intent, must always be tempered by wisdom concerning what knowledge is safe to pursue. The locations and individuals described herein have been deliberately obscured to protect both the living and the dead. Any resemblance to actual places or persons is purely coincidental, and readers are strongly advised not to attempt to identify or visit the sites mentioned in this account. Some doors should remain forever closed,